Hey there! Tonight we begin with a journey into the minds of history's greatest military strategists, where brilliant planning and execution determine the outcomes of wars and the fates of civilizations, where understanding logistics, psychology, terrain, and timing created advantages that no amount of courage alone could achieve, where the ability to see several moves ahead and to anticipate enemy responses separated genius commanders from merely competent ones, and where studying these strategic masterpieces reveals principles of planning, adaptation, and leadership that extend far beyond military applications, from Hannibal's audacious crossing of the Alps to the sophisticated deceptions of World War II, from the revolutionary mobile warfare of Mongol armies to the careful political military coordination that built empires, from strategies that achieved victory through avoiding battle to those that deliberately sought decisive encounters. The story of military strategy is one of human ingenuity applied to conflict, of innovation overcoming conventional wisdom, and of the ways that strategic thinking has shaped not just battles, but entire courses of history. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here, and let those comments know where the listening is happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about military history, it's easy to focus on dramatic battles, heroic stands, and decisive encounters. These moments are visible, well documented, and emotionally compelling. Yet behind every great victory lies strategic thinking. The planning, the coordination, the anticipation of enemy moves, the creation of favourable conditions, and the exploitation of opportunities that made victory possible. Strategy is the art of winning before fighting, of creating situations where success becomes likely or even inevitable. The brilliant strategies explored tonight transcend their immediate military context to reveal principles of planning, leadership, and execution that remain relevant across time and domains. Military strategy at its best represents human cognitive ability pushed to extremes, planning under uncertainty, coordinating complex operations, anticipating intelligent opposition, adapting to changing circumstances, and synthesizing countless variables into coherent plans of action. These cognitive challenges make military strategy a distinctive human achievement, worthy of study regardless of one's views on warfare itself. Picture this: a commander's tent anywhere in history, where maps spread across tables, where scouts report enemy positions and movements, where supply masters calculate how long provisions will last, where subordinates debate courses of action, and where the commander must synthesize all this information, add judgment and intuition, and make decisions that will determine whether thousands live or die, whether campaigns succeed or fail, whether nations survive or fall. The weight of such decisions is immense, yet history's greatest strategists made them repeatedly, often successfully, creating records of achievement that have fascinated students of strategy ever since. Tonight's journey explores brilliant military strategies from across human history, strategies that achieved seemingly impossible goals, that overcame enormous disadvantages, that revolutionized warfare, or that demonstrated such sophistication that they're still studied centuries later. From Hannibal's campaign in Italy to Alexander's conquests, from the Mongol strategic system to Napoleon's operational art, from the indirect approaches of ancient Chinese strategists to the deception operations of World War II, the exploration reveals both the specific brilliance of individual strategies and the broader principles of strategic thinking that unite diverse examples across time and cultures. Hannibal Barca's strategy during the Second Punic War represents one of history's most audacious and brilliant strategic conceptions. Unable to attack Rome directly due to Roman naval superiority, Hannibal conceived a plan to invade Italy overland, to break Rome's alliance system, and to defeat Rome through political means after demonstrating Roman military vulnerability. The strategy nearly succeeded despite enormous challenges, and its brilliance has been studied by military strategists for over 2 millennia. The strategic context was Carthage's weakness following defeat in the First Punic War. Rome had stripped Carthage of its Mediterranean possessions and imposed crushing indemnities. Direct naval assault on Italy was impossible. Rome's navy controlled the sea. Yet Hannibal, commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain, saw an alternative: an overland invasion through Gaul and across the Alps, appearing in Italy where Romans would least expect attack, and where Roman forces were unprepared. The brilliance began with the conception itself. The strategic surprise of appearing in northern Italy, having crossed the Alps with an army including elephants, would shake Roman confidence and provide Hannibal with the initiative once in Italy. Hannibal's strategy was to defeat Roman armies in battle, demonstrating Roman vulnerability to the Italian allies, who provided much of Rome's military manpower. If enough allies defected, Rome's ability to raise armies would collapse, forcing favourable peace terms without requiring Hannibal to besiege Rome itself. The operational execution demonstrated meticulous planning. Hannibal spent years preparing for the campaign, securing his base in Spain, establishing diplomatic relationships with Gallic tribes in southern France, gathering intelligence about Alpine passes, and assembling a diverse army capable of the demanding march ahead. The army that departed Spain in 218 BCE numbered perhaps 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants, a massive force requiring sophisticated logistics. The march from Spain to Italy covered over 1,000 miles through territory that ranged from friendly to hostile. Hannibal had to fight through tribes blocking his passage, had to manage river crossings including the Rhone with elephants and cavalry, and ultimately had to cross the Alps in conditions that killed roughly half his army. Yet he maintained force cohesion and arrived in northern Italy with perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry still capable of fighting. Reduced numbers, but a veteran force that had been tempered by the journey and that trusted its commander completely. Once in Italy, Hannibal's tactical brilliance, demonstrated at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and supremely at Cannae, served his broader strategy of shattering Roman military prestige. Each victory encouraged Italian allies to reconsider their loyalty to Rome. The defection of major cities like Capua validated Hannibal's strategy, and seemed to indicate that Rome's alliance system was indeed collapsing as planned. The strategic sophistication included understanding the difference between tactical and strategic victory. Hannibal didn't need to capture Rome, he needed to break Rome's political cohesion, to make continued resistance seem futile, to create conditions where negotiated settlement became Rome's preferred option. Every Roman army destroyed, every ally that defected, every demonstration of Rome's inability to protect its allies advanced this strategy even without directly threatening Rome itself. The logistical aspects were perhaps the most impressive strategic achievement. Maintaining an army in hostile territory for 15 years required extraordinary logistical skill. Hannibal had to forage extensively, had to maintain supply lines through contested territory, had to capture supplies from enemies, and had to keep his diverse army, Carthaginians, Iberians, Celts, Numidians, later Italian allies, fed, equipped and paid when Carthage provided minimal support from home. The logistical achievement of sustaining offensive operations under these conditions demonstrated strategic capability as impressive as any tactical victory. The diplomatic strategy was equally sophisticated. Hannibal actively worked to build alliances with Rome's enemies. Philip V of Macedon, Syracuse, various Italian cities. The strategy of creating multiple threats that would strain Roman resources reflected understanding of grand strategy that went beyond purely military considerations. A coordinated multi-front war against Rome could achieve what Hannibal's Italian campaign alone could not. Yet the strategy ultimately failed, revealing its limitations and the areas where strategic brilliance proved insufficient. Rome's fundamental strength, its capacity to absorb catastrophic defeats and continue fighting, its deep reserves of manpower, its unwavering determination, couldn't be overcome by even brilliant strategy without support that Carthage failed to provide. The Roman counter-strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal while attacking Carthaginian possessions in Spain and eventually in Africa demonstrated strategic sophistication that matched and ultimately defeated Hannibal's approach. The Fabian strategy that Rome adopted after Cannae, avoiding direct confrontation, shadowing Hannibal's army, attacking supply lines and foragers, gradually reconquering defected allies, represented brilliant strategic response that neutralized Hannibal's tactical advantages while leveraging Rome's strategic strengths. Fabius understood that Rome could afford to trade space and time for avoiding the decisive battles where Hannibal excelled, while Hannibal couldn't afford the attrition of a long war of maneuver without decisive results. The opening of new theatres demonstrated Roman strategic thinking. Scipio Africanus's campaigns in Spain systematically dismantled Carthaginian power bases, depriving Hannibal of reinforcements and eventually threatening Carthage itself. The invasion of Africa forced Carthage to recall Hannibal, ending his Italian campaign without Rome having defeated him directly in Italy. The counter-strategy of attacking the enemy's base while enduring but not decisively engaging their main army showed strategic sophistication equal to Hannibal's. The lessons from Hannibal's strategy have influenced military thinking across millennia. The concept of the indirect approach, attacking where the enemy is weak rather than strong, seeking political rather than purely military objectives, using surprise and maneuver to create advantages, became recognized as a fundamental strategic principle. Liddell Hart's 20th century strategic theories explicitly drew on Hannibal's example to argue for indirect approaches in modern warfare. The importance of logistics and sustainability emerge clearly. Brilliant tactical victories without adequate logistical support and without capability to sustain operations eventually fail. Hannibal's tactical genius couldn't overcome the strategic reality that he was operating at the end of extended supply lines, with minimal support against an enemy, fighting in its own territory with deep reserves. The integration of military and political strategy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of warfare's purpose. Hannibal recognized that destroying armies was means, not end. The goal was political change in Rome's alliance system and eventually in Rome's willingness to fight. This clear-eyed focus on political objectives rather than purely military ones showed strategic maturity that transcended tactical excellence. The psychological dimensions, using strategic surprise, maintaining initiative, demonstrating enemy vulnerability, revealed understanding of warfare's mental aspects. Much of Hannibal's strategy aimed at Roman and Italian psychology as much as at Roman armies, seeking to create beliefs about Roman vulnerability and about continuing the war's futility that would produce political effects without requiring complete military victory. Understanding Hannibal's strategy requires recognizing both its brilliance and its ultimate insufficiency. The conception was audacious, the planning meticulous, the execution remarkable, and the tactical implementation superb. Yet brilliant strategy couldn't overcome the fundamental mismatch in strategic resources and determination between Carthage and Rome. The campaign demonstrates that strategy matters enormously. Different, less sophisticated strategy would have failed faster, but also that strategy alone cannot overcome major disadvantages in resources, political will, and support from home. The influence on subsequent strategic thinking has been profound. Napoleon studied Hannibal's campaigns intensively. Moltke and the German general staff analysed his operations. Modern strategists continue to examine his indirect approach, his use of surprise and manoeuvre, his integration of tactical and strategic objectives. Hannibal's strategy remains relevant not because it succeeded in all its aims, but because it demonstrated principles of strategic thinking that transcend the specific historical context and that illuminate how to approach strategic problems with creativity, audacity, and sophistication that transforms apparently impossible situations into near successes that reveal what might have been with slightly different circumstances or slightly more support. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul demonstrates brilliant strategy that combined long-term vision with tactical flexibility, political manoeuvring with military prowess, an understanding of both military operations and Roman politics. The campaign transformed Caesar from a mere politician into Rome's most successful general, while extending Roman power across a vast territory and setting foundations for Caesar's eventual civil war and dictatorship. The strategic context was Caesar's need for military glory and wealth to advance his political career in Rome. Appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, Caesar saw opportunity in the unstable situation north of Roman territories. Gallic tribes were in flux, migrations were occurring, and the situation created pretexts for intervention that could serve Caesar's ambitions while genuinely advancing Roman interests. The initial strategy centered on intervention against the Helvetii migration in 58 BCE. Caesar portrayed this migration as threatening Roman allies and interests, requiring military response. The campaign demonstrated the pattern that would characterize the entire conquest, using specific threats or opportunities as justifications for military action that advanced broader strategic goals of expanding Roman power and Caesar's own glory. The strategic brilliance included recognizing opportunities and exploiting them rapidly. When Gallic tribes requested Roman assistance against the Germanic king Ariovistus, Caesar intervened, defeating the Germans and establishing Roman presence and influence deeper in Gaul. Each campaign built on previous successes, with military victories creating new political situations that generated new opportunities for intervention, gradually extending Roman control across Gaul. The operational tempo Caesar maintained was remarkable. Most Roman governors pursued leisurely campaigns, seeking glory through a single major victory. Caesar campaigned relentlessly, winter and summer, maintaining pressure on enemies and never allowing them time to consolidate opposition. The aggressive tempo kept enemies off balance, prevented coalition formation, and demonstrated Roman power so thoroughly that resistance increasingly seemed futile. The tactical flexibility complemented strategic vision. Caesar adapted to diverse challenges: Germanic cavalry charges, Gallic fortifications, naval warfare against the Veneti, guerrilla warfare in difficult terrain, sieges of heavily fortified positions. The diversity of challenges Gaul presented required constant tactical innovation, and Caesar's ability to analyse each situation and develop effective responses demonstrated military genius that went beyond applying fixed formulas. The engineering capabilities Caesar employed were extraordinary. Roman engineering generally was sophisticated, but Caesar employed it with particular effectiveness. The siege of Alesia, surrounding the Gallic stronghold with fortifications, then building additional fortifications facing outward to defend against the relief army, created a double circumvallation that allowed Caesar's smaller force to defeat both the besieged Gauls and the massive relief force. The engineering feat was as important as tactical skill in achieving victory. The political strategy intertwined with military operations. Caesar regularly sent detailed reports, his commentaries on the Gallic War, to Rome, shaping public perception of his campaigns, justifying his actions, emphasizing dangers to Roman interests, and ensuring that political opposition couldn't effectively challenge his narrative. The commentaries were propaganda masterpieces that secured political support for military operations while building Caesar's reputation and popularity. The intelligence and scouting emphasized by Caesar provided crucial advantages. Roman forces maintained extensive cavalry screens, employed local guides, gathered information from traders and travelers, and developed understanding of Gallic political dynamics that allowed exploitation of tribal rivalries. The information advantage contributed to tactical and operational successes, while supporting the political strategy of appearing to intervene on behalf of Gallic allies against their enemies. The treatment of defeated enemies showed strategic sophistication. Caesar alternated between generous treatment of those who surrendered and terrible punishment of those who continued resistance after submission. The strategy created incentives for surrender, while demonstrating the costs of continued opposition. The carrot-and-stick approach accelerated conquest by making submission attractive compared to the alternative of destruction. The management of logistics was exemplary. Maintaining legions far from Roman supply bases required sophisticated logistics. Caesar established supply networks, organized foraging systematically, built relationships with friendly tribes who provided provisions, and ensured that his armies remained supplied even during challenging campaigns. The logistical competence allowed operational tempo that kept enemies off balance. The integration of naval and land operations demonstrated versatility. The campaign against the Veneti required building a fleet, and learning naval warfare's particulars, Caesar's willingness to operate in unfamiliar domains and to develop capabilities needed for specific challenges, showed strategic flexibility that refused to be constrained by existing capabilities, but rather developed new capabilities as strategic requirements dictated. The suppression of Vercingetorix's revolt in 52 BCE showed strategic understanding of the difference between conquering and controlling. The widespread revolt demonstrated that military victories hadn't created genuine Roman authority. Continued military presence and periodic punishment of resistance were necessary. Caesar's systematic suppression, culminating in the siege of Alesia, re-established Roman control through demonstrating both military capability and willingness to use it ruthlessly. The political consequences in Rome were as important as military achievements. Caesar's conquest made him immensely wealthy. The loot from Gaul funded his subsequent political and military activities. The veterans of Gallic campaigns formed a loyal army personally devoted to Caesar. providing military force for the civil war. The reputation as Rome's greatest general made Caesar politically formidable, though it also frightened political opponents into desperate measures to contain him. The strategic legacy of the Gallic conquest extended far beyond Caesar's lifetime. The incorporation of Gaul into the Roman Empire changed Europe's cultural and political geography. The Romanization of Gaul created the foundation for France, with Latin evolving into French and Roman institutions shaping French development. The strategic significance of controlling the territory north to the Rhine shaped Roman and later European strategic thinking for centuries. The military innovations influenced Roman warfare. Caesar's emphasis on speed and aggression, his engineering applications, his tactical flexibility, and his integration of different force types became models for Roman military practice. The legions that conquered the empire learned from Caesar's methods, spreading his approach throughout Roman military culture. Understanding Caesar's Gallic strategy requires appreciating the integration of military, political, and personal objectives. The campaigns weren't simply military operations, but rather complex endeavours that served multiple purposes simultaneously, extending Roman power, advancing Caesar's career, enriching Caesar and his followers, building loyal military forces, and creating reputation and narrative that shaped Roman politics. The sophistication lay in recognizing how these objectives reinforced each other and in executing campaigns that advanced all simultaneously. The lessons about strategic vision combined with tactical adaptability remain relevant. Caesar maintained clear long-term goals, conquering Gaul, building military reputation, accumulating wealth and power, while remaining flexible about methods and opportunistic about specific operations. The combination of vision and flexibility, of strategic consistency and tactical opportunism, characterizes effective strategy across domains. The importance of tempo and initiative emerged clearly. Caesar's relentless campaigning prevented enemies from organizing effective opposition, maintained pressure that wore down resistance, and demonstrated that Roman power was overwhelming and constant. The strategic offensive, maintained through tactical and operational aggressiveness, created psychological impact that multiplied military advantages. Caesar's Gallic conquest thus represents military strategy at a very high level, combining vision and flexibility, military prowess and political understanding, tactical excellence and strategic patience, ruthlessness and generosity as circumstances required. The achievement was impressive militarily, consequential historically, and influential for subsequent strategic thinking. The conquest demonstrated how a brilliant strategist could achieve seemingly impossible goals through combining multiple advantages, maintaining initiative, adapting to challenges, and never losing sight of ultimate objectives even while dealing with immediate tactical problems. These lessons transcend the specific Roman context and illuminate timeless principles of effective strategy. The strategic system Genghis Khan and his successors developed represents one of history's most revolutionary approaches to warfare and conquest. The Mongol strategies integrated unprecedented mobility, sophisticated intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, meritocratic organization, and adaptive tactics to conquer the largest contiguous land empire in history. Understanding the Mongol strategic approach reveals innovation that transcended anything contemporary civilizations had developed and that changed warfare fundamentally. The foundation was mobility unmatched by any contemporary military system. Mongol armies on horseback could cover 60 to 100 miles per day, far exceeding infantry-based armies' capabilities. Each warrior had multiple horses, allowing the rotation that maintained high speeds over long distances. This operational mobility created strategic advantages that contemporary opponents couldn't counter. Mongol armies appeared where unexpected, concentrated rapidly, and disappeared before opponents could respond effectively. The strategic use of mobility manifested in campaigns that covered vast distances with coordination that seemed impossible to opponents. The invasion of Europe in 1241 saw Mongol armies operating across fronts separated by hundreds of miles, coordinating movements through courier systems that maintained communication, despite distances that would have fragmented any contemporary European force. The capacity to coordinate operations at unprecedented scales gave Mongols strategic capabilities qualitatively different from opponents. The intelligence and reconnaissance system was extraordinarily sophisticated. Mongols systematically gathered information about potential enemies years before campaigns began, sending merchants and travellers to map terrain, to assess defences, to identify political divisions that could be exploited. By the time Mongol armies arrived, commanders possessed detailed knowledge about enemy capabilities, about terrain, about potential allies, and about the most effective approaches. The information advantage often determined campaign outcomes before fighting began. The psychological warfare integrated with military operations to multiply force effectiveness. Mongols cultivated reputations for invincibility and for horrific treatment of resistors, while offering generous terms to those who submitted without fighting. Cities that surrendered immediately received protection and relatively good treatment. Cities that resisted and were captured suffered total destruction, with populations massacred as examples to others. The psychological strategy meant that many cities surrendered without fighting, dramatically reducing the military force required for conquest. The terror tactics were deliberate strategic choices rather than random cruelty. The massacres, the destruction, the pyramids of skulls, all served to create terror that facilitated subsequent conquests. The brutality was calibrated, enough to terrify but not so indiscriminate that resistance seemed preferable to surrender. The psychological impact of Mongol reputation often achieved strategic results, with minimal actual fighting, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of how fear could serve as strategic weapon. The meritocratic organization created military advantages that hereditary systems couldn't match. Promotion based on ability rather than birth meant that talented individuals rose to command regardless of social origin. The diversity of the empire meant that specialists from conquered peoples, Chinese engineers, Muslim administrators, European craftsmen, were employed in capacities where their skills advanced Mongol interests. The pragmatism about using whoever was useful, rather than restricting authority to ethnic Mongols, created capabilities that purely ethnic armies couldn't match. The tactical flexibility and willingness to learn from enemies demonstrated strategic sophistication. Mongols adapted Chinese siege warfare techniques when conquering fortified cities. They employed Muslim naval expertise when operations required maritime capabilities. They incorporated heavy cavalry from conquered peoples to supplement their horse archers. The tactical eclecticism, the willingness to adopt whatever worked regardless of origin, gave Mongols capability to address diverse challenges effectively. The logistics system supporting operations across vast distances was remarkably effective. The Yam system, a network of way stations with fresh horses and supplies, allowed rapid communication and movement across the empire. The ability to live off the land through systematic foraging, and through extracting supplies from conquered territories, reduced baggage trains and maintained mobility. The logistical sophistication enabled strategic reach that would have been impossible with conventional supply systems. The strategic patience and planning horizon distinguished Mongol strategies from contemporary approaches. Campaigns were planned years in advance, with preliminary moves like establishing trade relationships or diplomatic contacts with potential enemies, creating conditions for eventual invasion. The willingness to spend years preparing ensured that when campaigns began, the conditions favoured success. The patient approach contrasted with the opportunistic raids that characterised much medieval warfare. The political strategy of exploiting divisions among enemies proved repeatedly effective. Mongols identified factions within enemy societies, religious minorities, ethnic groups chafing under rulers, political opponents of current regimes, and cultivated these as potential allies, or at least as groups that wouldn't resist Mongol conquest. The strategy of arriving not as mere conquerors, but as potential liberators from unpopular rulers eased conquest and reduced resistance. The administrative integration of conquered territories showed strategic vision, extending beyond conquest. Rather than simply extracting tribute and leaving existing structures largely intact, Mongols developed administrative systems that integrated conquered territories into the empire, established regular taxation, promoted trade across regions, and created genuinely imperial structures. The empire-building vision transformed military conquest into lasting political entity that outlasted the initial conquests. The religious tolerance was strategically motivated. By allowing conquered peoples to maintain their religions, Mongols reduced religious resistance and gained cooperation from religious communities, grateful for protection. The Mongol strategic pragmatism recognized that forcing religious conversion would create unnecessary opposition, while tolerance cost nothing and bought cooperation. The policy demonstrated that ideological flexibility served strategic interests better than rigid imposition. The strategic weaknesses that eventually limited Mongol expansion revealed the system's limitations. The dependence on mobility and on horse archers meant that Mongols were less effective in terrain unsuited to cavalry. Dense forests, mountains, very wet regions. The Japanese islands defeated Mongol invasions partly because maritime operations didn't leverage Mongol strength's European heavy cavalry and fortifications, combined with political fragmentation that prevented presenting unified targets, made Europe harder to conquer permanently than the centralized Asian empires. The succession struggles that plagued the empire after Genghis Khan's death showed that the political system hadn't solved the problem of peaceful power transfer. The civil wars that divided the empire demonstrated that military prowess couldn't create stable political institutions without additional development. The empire's fragmentation into separate khanates revealed that conquest didn't automatically create lasting political unity. Understanding Mongol strategy requires recognizing both the revolutionary innovations and the ways that these innovations were suited to specific circumstances. The cavalry mobility, the vast Eurasian steppe that allowed rapid movement, the political fragmentation of enemies, and the terror tactics' effectiveness all reflected particular historical contexts. Yet the principles demonstrated importance of mobility and information, value of psychological warfare, benefits of meritocracy and flexibility, necessity of logistics for sustained operations, transcend specific contexts. The influence on subsequent warfare was substantial, though often unrecognized. The emphasis on mobility, the integration of different force types, the sophisticated intelligence gathering, and the coordination of operations across vast distances all influenced military thinking in societies that studied Mongol methods. The recognition that mobile forces could achieve strategic effects beyond their numerical strength influenced later development of cavalry and eventually mechanized forces. The Mongol strategic system thus represents an extraordinary achievement, a nomadic people from the steppes, developing strategies and capabilities that conquered civilizations far more numerous and apparently more sophisticated. The strategic innovation that made this possible, the mobility, intelligence, psychology, organization, and logistics, demonstrated that strategic creativity could overcome apparent disadvantages and could create capabilities that transformed military possibilities. The lessons about strategy, transcending resources, about innovation overcoming conventional advantages, and about comprehensive strategic systems, achieving results that tactical excellence alone cannot remain relevant for understanding strategy across domains. Napoleon Bonaparte's strategic and operational methods revolutionized warfare, creating the operational level of war as a distinct concept and establishing patterns that influence military thinking for the next century. Napoleon's brilliance lay not in single innovations, but in integrating tactical, operational, and strategic levels into a comprehensive approach to warfare that achieved decisive results with remarkable consistency for nearly 2 decades. The foundation was Napoleon's understanding of concentration and maneuver, the strategy of concentrating superior force at decisive points, while keeping enemies dispersed or confused about French intentions, created tactical advantages that Napoleon's superior tactics could exploit. The operational mobility that allowed rapid concentration from dispersed positions gave Napoleon capability to create favourable force ratios at points of contact, even when overall numbers approached parity. The core system organisational innovation provided the structure enabling Napoleon's operational art. Each corps was a combined arms miniature army capable of independent operations, including infantry, cavalry, artillery, and support elements. The corps could march independently on separate routes, preventing the congestion that would occur with entire armies on single roads, then concentrate rapidly for battle. The organisational innovation solved the practical problem of moving large armies while maintaining ability to concentrate force when needed. The operational tempo Napoleon maintained disoriented opponents and prevented effective response. Campaigns were conducted at speeds that contemporary armies couldn't match, with French forces appearing unexpectedly, fighting battles, and achieving objectives before enemies could effectively respond. The emphasis on speed as a weapon, maneuver rapidly to create surprise, concentrate quickly to achieve local superiority, exploit success aggressively to prevent enemy recovery, created cascading advantages that tactical victories alone couldn't achieve. The strategic approach emphasized decisive battle and total victory. Napoleon sought battle with enemy main forces, aiming to destroy enemy armies in decisive encounters that would force favorable peace terms. The strategy contrasted with 18th century warfare's emphasis on maneuver and limited objectives. Napoleon's willingness to stake everything on battles reflected confidence in his tactical superiority and in his ability to exploit victory through vigorous pursuit that prevented defeated enemies from reconstituting. The operational planning balanced careful preparation with aggressive execution. Napoleon studied terrain, arranged supply depots, planned march routes, and coordinated movements meticulously. But once operations began, Napoleon adapted rapidly to changing circumstances, exploiting opportunities and adjusting plans based on enemy reactions. The combination of careful planning and aggressive flexibility characterized Napoleon's operational approach. The integration of political and military strategy showed sophisticated understanding of warfare's purposes. Napoleon recognized that military victories needed to produce political results. Favorable peace terms, territorial gains, the elimination of coalitions, the strategy of defeating enemies so thoroughly that they would accept French terms, shaped operational planning and campaign objectives. The clear focus on political goals prevented operations that were militarily successful but strategically meaningless. The use of central position strategy appeared repeatedly in Napoleon's campaigns. When facing multiple enemy armies, Napoleon would position French forces between them. Preventing junction, he would then defeat the armies sequentially, using interior lines to shift forces rapidly between opponents faster than they could coordinate. The 1814 campaign demonstrated the strategy brilliantly. Napoleon repeatedly defeated Allied armies that separately outnumbered him by preventing their concentration. The exploitation of maneuver to compensate for numerical disadvantage became characteristic. When outnumbered, Napoleon used mobility to create local superiority at decisive points. The Ulm campaign in 1805 showed this brilliantly. Napoleon maneuvered to position French forces behind the Austrian army, forcing surrender without major battle. The strategic maneuver achieved results that tactical battle would have required at higher cost. The artillery employment demonstrated tactical innovation with strategic implications. Napoleon massed artillery at decisive points, creating overwhelming firepower that shattered enemy formations, opening gaps for infantry or cavalry exploitation. The grand battery concept, concentrating dozens of guns to create devastating fire, gave Napoleon capability to break strong defensive positions that previous artillery employment couldn't achieve. The psychological dimensions included building confidence in French forces and creating doubt in enemies. The reputation for invincibility, the aggressive tactics, the decisive victories, all contributed to psychological advantages French soldiers expected to win, giving them morale advantages in battle. Enemy soldiers fought with the knowledge that they faced the most successful general and army in Europe, creating psychological disadvantages that affected performance. The logistical approach emphasized living off the land rather than maintaining supply lines. French armies foraged systematically, extracting provisions from territories they operated in, reducing the baggage trains that slowed movement. The system worked well in rich territories but created problems in poor regions, or when operating in areas already devastated by war. The logistics system enabled operational tempo, but created sustainability problems that contributed to the Russian disaster. The political consequences of military success included establishing French hegemony across much of Europe, spreading revolutionary Napoleonic institutional reforms, redrawing European political boundaries, and creating the context where Napoleon could build an empire. The military successes translated into political power that reshaped Europe, demonstrating how military strategy serves political purposes. The strategic overreach that ultimately destroyed Napoleon revealed limitations. The Russian campaign's failure showed that Napoleon's system had vulnerabilities: overconfidence, inadequate adaptation to different strategic circumstances, logistics breakdowns, and the inability to force decisive battle against opponents who refused to fight on Napoleon's terms. The Spanish guerrilla war demonstrated that Napoleon's conventional military brilliance couldn't solve unconventional warfare challenges. The coalition strategies that eventually defeated Napoleon showed that strategic learning occurs and that even brilliant strategies can be countered. The Allies learned to avoid decisive battles with Napoleon's main force, to coordinate operations across multiple fronts, to maintain coalitions despite defeats, and to leverage superior overall resources through attrition that couldn't be solved by operational brilliance. The counter-strategies developed against Napoleon showed that no strategy remains effective indefinitely against adaptive opponents. The influence on military thinking has been profound and lasting. The Prussian military reform after 1806, the development of general staff systems, the emphasis on rapid mobilization and concentration, the operational art concept itself, all drew on Napoleonic methods. Military academies worldwide studied Napoleon's campaigns as exemplars of operational excellence. The influence persisted through the 19th and into the 20th century, with both world wars showing Napoleonic influences in operational concepts. Understanding Napoleon's strategic and operational approach requires recognizing the integration of multiple elements into a comprehensive system. No single innovation explained Napoleon's success, rather, the combination of organizational structure, core system, operational methods, concentration, maneuver, tempo, tactical superiority, artillery employment, combined arms, and strategic vision, seeking decisive results, integrating political military objectives, created capabilities that overwhelmed opponents for nearly 2 decades. The lessons about integrating tactical, operational and strategic levels remain foundational for military thinking. Napoleon demonstrated that tactical excellence without operational skill cannot achieve decisive results, that operational success without strategic purpose produces meaningless victories, and that strategy without capabilities to execute remains fantasy. The integration across levels, the maintenance of clear objectives while remaining flexible about methods, and the aggressive exploitation of advantages once created, these Napoleonic principles transcend the specific historical context and illuminate how to approach strategy comprehensively. The limitations revealed by Napoleon's eventual defeat are equally instructive. Brilliant strategy cannot overcome fundamental mismatches in resources when opponents adapt and coordinate effectively. Overconfidence born of repeated success can blind strategists to change circumstances. Strategies optimized for certain conditions, conventional warfare in rich territories against separate opponents, may fail in different conditions. Unconventional warfare, poor logistics, coordinated coalition strategies. The recognition that no strategy remains effective indefinitely against intelligent opposition provides important balance to appreciation of Napoleon's achievements. Napoleon's strategic legacy thus includes both the positive contributions, the operational art, the integration of levels, the emphasis on concentration and maneuver, and the cautionary lessons about overreach, about strategy's limitations, and about the necessity for continued adaptation. This comprehensive understanding makes Napoleon's campaigns enduringly valuable for studying strategy, while avoiding the trap of treating his methods as universally applicable formulas rather than as context-dependent approaches that require adaptation to specific circumstances. The specific campaigns Genghis Khan and his successors conducted demonstrate how the strategic principles discussed earlier were applied to achieve spectacular results. Examining particular campaigns reveals the operational level execution that translated strategic concepts into concrete victories and conquests. The Khwarezmian campaign, 1219 to 1221, showcased Mongol strategy at its most sophisticated. When the Khwarezmian Shah executed Mongol ambassadors, Genghis Khan planned a devastating response. Rather than simply seeking revenge through raiding, he conceived a systematic campaign to utterly destroy the Khwarezmian Empire as demonstration of the consequences of opposing Mongols. The invasion began with extensive intelligence preparation. Mongol scouts, merchants, and spies had mapped Khwarezmian territories, identified major cities, assessed garrison strengths, and understood the political situation within the empire. By the time Mongol armies invaded, their commanders possessed detailed knowledge that facilitated rapid and efficient operations. The operational approach employed multiple army groups operating independently, but with strategic coordination. Different Mongol forces attacked various Khwarezmian cities simultaneously, preventing concentration of defenders and creating sense of overwhelming assault from all directions. The coordination across hundreds of miles of front demonstrated command and control capabilities far beyond contemporary norms. The siege warfare demonstrated tactical adaptation. Khwarezmian cities were heavily fortified, requiring sophisticated siege techniques to capture Mongols. Employed Chinese engineers who brought siege warfare expertise, built siege engines, understood how to approach fortifications systematically, and introduced capabilities that nomadic cavalry alone couldn't provide. The willingness to incorporate specialized expertise shows strategic flexibility that many armies couldn't achieve. The pursuit of the Shah exemplified how Mongols combined strategic patience with tactical aggressiveness. When the Shah fled his collapsing empire, Mongol forces pursued him relentlessly across hundreds of miles, eventually hounding him to death from exhaustion and fear without requiring direct combat. The pursuit demonstrated that Mongols wouldn't allow defeated enemies to escape and rebuild, establishing principle that resistance led to inevitable destruction regardless of time and distance involved. The destruction of Khwarezmian cities sent powerful messages. Nishapur, Herat, Merv, great cities of Central Asia, were systematically destroyed with populations massacred. The ruins served as monuments to Mongol power and as warnings to others considering resistance. The psychological warfare aspect transformed military victories into strategic advantages extending far beyond immediate campaign. The subsequent reconnaissance into Europe demonstrated strategic vision extending beyond immediate conquests. After destroying Khwarezm, Genghis Khan sent forces under Jib and Subutai on reconnaissance through the Caucasus and into Russia. The expedition covered thousands of miles, gathered intelligence about European territories, defeated various armies including Russian princes at the Kalka River, and returned with information that would facilitate later Mongol invasions. The European invasion of 1241 to 1242 under Batu Khan and Subutai showed Mongol strategic capabilities at continental scale. Multiple Mongol army groups invaded Poland and Hungary simultaneously, achieving coordination across fronts separated by vast distances. The campaign's sophistication, synchronized operations, rapid concentration when needed, effective intelligence, devastating tactical execution, overwhelmed European opponents who couldn't coordinate effectively. The Battle of Legnica in Poland demonstrated tactical innovation. Faced with European heavy cavalry, Mongols employed feigned retreats to draw cavalry away from infantry, then surrounded and destroyed the pursuing forces with horse archery. The tactic was repeated successfully across multiple encounters, showing that Mongols could adapt to different opponents' tactical systems effectively. The Battle of Mohi in Hungary exemplified Mongol operational art. The Mongols employed night maneuvers to position forces around the Hungarian camp, attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, employed smoke to create confusion, and destroyed the Hungarian army so thoroughly that the kingdom lay defenceless. The victory demonstrated combined arms coordination, tactical sophistication, and ruthless exploitation that characterized Mongol warfare at its peak. The withdrawal from Europe after Mongol leader Ogedei Khan's death showed strategic discipline. Despite complete victory over Hungarian and Polish forces, and despite clear capability to continue conquering westward, Mongol armies withdrew to participate in succession politics. The withdrawal demonstrated that strategic objectives beyond mere conquest governed operations, and that military operations served broader political purposes within Mongol strategic thinking. The conquest of Song China demonstrated capability to conduct extended campaigns against sophisticated opponents. The Song dynasty possessed strong fortifications, large armies, advanced weaponry including gunpowder weapons, and wealth to sustain long resistance. Mongol conquest took decades and required systematic campaigns that ground down Song resistance through combination of military pressure, psychological warfare, and political manipulation that gradually isolated Song from potential allies. The siege of Xianyang exemplified the determination Mongols brought to difficult objectives. The siege lasted 5 years, 1268 to 1273, requiring continuous investment of forces and resources to reduce the strategically critical city. The willingness to sustain operations for years showed that Mongols combined their characteristic mobility and speed with patience and persistence when objectives required extended efforts. The naval operations against Japan revealed Mongol limitations. The attempted invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 showed that Mongol capabilities didn't translate effectively to maritime warfare. The failures demonstrated that even the most successful military systems have boundaries, and that certain operational environments negate particular strengths. The typhoons that destroyed the Second Invasion Fleet, the kamikaze or divine wind, combined with Japanese defensive preparations to inflict rare, decisive defeats on Mongol arms. The strategic legacy of Mongol campaigns extends beyond specific victories to broader impacts. The destruction of Khwarezm and other Central Asian centres permanently altered the region's cultural and economic landscape. The Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe traumatized those regions and shaped their subsequent development. The conquest of China established foreign rule that influenced Chinese political development, and that eventually transformed into the Yuan dynasty. The extent of Mongol conquest created the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace across Eurasian trade routes that facilitated commerce and cultural exchange on unprecedented scales. Understanding Mongol campaigns reveals how strategic principles translate into operational reality. The mobility, intelligence, psychological warfare, tactical flexibility, and logistical capabilities that characterize Mongol strategy found concrete expression in campaigns that achieved objectives through combinations of speed, surprise, overwhelming force at decisive points, and ruthless exploitation of success. The campaigns demonstrate that effective strategy requires not just good ideas but effective execution. The capability to translate strategic concepts into operational plans and tactical actions that achieve concrete results. The lessons include recognizing that different operational environments require different approaches. Mongol methods succeeded brilliantly in environments suited to cavalry mobility, but encountered limits when facing terrain, fortifications, or maritime conditions that negated mobility advantages. The adaptability Mongols showed, incorporating siege warfare, naval capabilities, and diverse tactics, extended their effective range but couldn't completely overcome environments fundamentally unsuited to their core capabilities. The campaigns also demonstrate the importance of sustained pressure and patient pursuit of long-term objectives. The multi-year campaigns against Khwarezm, against Song China, against various European territories showed that Mongol strategy combined their famous speed with strategic patience, understanding that some objectives required extended efforts rather than rapid strikes. The combination of fast operational tempo with strategic patience created capabilities across timescales that opponents couldn't match. The Mongol campaigns thus exemplify brilliant strategy expressed through operational excellence that achieved historically unprecedented results. The conquest of the largest contiguous land empire in history required more than military prowess. It required strategic vision, operational sophistication, tactical excellence, and sustained execution across decades. The specific campaigns through which these achievements occurred reveal the translation of strategic principles into concrete historical reality, demonstrating how brilliant strategy manifests in actual operations that change history. As this exploration of history's most brilliant military strategies concludes, what emerges is recognition of both strategy's transformative power and its inherent limitations. The strategies examined, from Hannibal's audacious Italian campaign to Napoleon's operational art, from Mongol continental conquest to the sophisticated strategic thinking of history's greatest commanders, demonstrate that human intelligence applied to conflict can create remarkable achievements, can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles, and can shape history's course through planned, executed, and adapted operations. The common threads across these diverse strategies reveal principles that transcend specific contexts. The importance of clear objectives appears consistently. Successful strategies begin with understanding what they aim to achieve and maintain focus on those objectives while remaining flexible about methods. Hannibal knew he needed to break Rome's alliance system, not capture Rome itself. Caesar understood that Gallic conquest required demonstrating Roman power repeatedly until resistance seemed futile. Napoleon sought decisive battles that would force favourable peace terms. The clarity about purposes prevented strategic drift and ensured that tactical successes advanced strategic objectives. The integration of intelligence and information with operational planning emerges as crucial. Successful strategists from Mongol commanders to Napoleon emphasized knowing enemies, their strengths, weaknesses, political situations, terrain they operated in, and their likely reactions to various moves. The information advantage created by systematic intelligence gathering often determined outcomes before fighting began, demonstrating that knowledge translates directly into strategic capability. The balance between careful planning and adaptive execution appears repeatedly. None of the brilliant strategies examined succeeded through rigid plan adherence. All required adaptation to circumstances, exploitation of opportunities, and response to enemy actions. Yet the adaptation occurred within strategic frameworks that maintained coherent purposes and that ensured tactical adjustments advanced broader objectives. The combination of vision and flexibility, of strategic consistency and tactical opportunism, characterizes effective strategy across contexts. The recognition that war is fundamentally political, that military operations serve political purposes, and that military success without political results is strategically meaningless, unites the most sophisticated strategic thinking. Hannibal understood his military victories needed to produce political change in Rome's alliance system. Caesar integrated military conquest with political advancement seamlessly. Napoleon's campaigns aimed at forcing favourable peace settlements. The clarity that military means serve political ends prevents confusing tactical excellence with strategic success. The importance of tempo, initiative, and maintaining pressure on enemies appears across successful strategies. Whether through Mongol mobility, Napoleonic operational speed, Caesar's relentless campaigning, or other approaches, successful strategies prevented enemies from recovering, regrouping, and organising effective response. The maintenance of initiative kept enemies reactive and prevented them from executing their own strategies effectively. The integration of multiple advantages, organisational, tactical, technological, psychological, logistical, created capabilities exceeding any single advantage's contribution. Napoleon's success required corps organisation, artillery employment, operational mobility, and tactical doctrine working together. Mongol conquests required mobility, intelligence, psychological warfare, tactical flexibility, and meritocratic organisation reinforcing each other. The systemic nature of brilliant strategy, creating comprehensive approaches where elements reinforce each other, distinguishes truly effective strategies from one-dimensional approaches. Yet the limitations of even brilliant strategies deserve equal emphasis. Hannibal's strategic and tactical genius couldn't overcome Rome's superior resources and determination. When Carthage provided inadequate support, Napoleon's operational brilliance ultimately failed against coordinated coalitions that adapted their strategies to avoid his strengths. Mongol conquests encountered limits in terrain and operational environments unsuited to cavalry warfare. Caesar's military success contributed to his political assassination, showing that military brilliance doesn't guarantee favourable political outcomes. The fundamental limitation is that strategy cannot overcome massive disadvantages in resources, political will, or adaptability. Brilliant strategy can multiply force effectiveness, can achieve results that conventional approaches couldn't produce, and can win campaigns despite unfavourable odds. But when disadvantages are too great, or when opponents adapt effectively, even brilliant strategy proves insufficient. The recognition that strategy has limits prevents the error of imagining that clever planning can overcome any disadvantage. The context dependency of strategy means that approaches succeeding in particular circumstances may fail in others. Mongol cavalry tactics dominated open terrain, but struggled in forests, mountains, and maritime environments. Napoleon's system worked brilliantly in rich territories, where armies could live off the land but collapsed in Russia, where logistics couldn't be managed through foraging. The specificity of strategies to particular contexts requires careful thought about whether principles from one context apply to different circumstances. The adaptive opposition problem means that no strategy remains effective indefinitely. Enemies study successful strategies, develop counters, and adapt their approaches to negate advantages. The Allied strategies that eventually defeated Napoleon drew explicitly on understanding his methods and developing responses. The recognition that strategic advantages erode through enemy adaptation should inspire humility about any particular strategy's permanence. The integration of moral and ethical considerations with strategic effectiveness remains important even while acknowledging historical commanders' often brutal methods. The Mongol use of terror, the ruthlessness of many commanders towards civilian populations, the willingness to sacrifice soldiers' lives for strategic advantage, all raise ethical questions about whether effectiveness alone justifies strategies. Modern strategic thinking must balance effectiveness with ethical constraints that historical commanders didn't acknowledge, creating different challenges for contemporary strategists. The contemporary relevance of studying historical military strategies extends beyond military applications. The principles of strategic thinking, clarity about objectives, integration of multiple advantages, balance of planning and adaptation, recognition of resource constraints, anticipation of opposition responses, apply across domains from business to politics to personal decision-making. The study of military strategy illuminates general principles of effective planning and execution under opposition that transcend military contexts. The future of strategy must account for technological changes that transform warfare's nature. Nuclear weapons, cyber capabilities, autonomous systems, space-based assets, and other technologies create strategic environments fundamentally different from historical contexts. Yet the underlying cognitive challenges, planning under uncertainty, coordinating complex operations, anticipating intelligent opposition, adapting to unexpected developments, remain relevant even as material circumstances change. As light returns and this journey through brilliant military strategies concludes, what lingers is appreciation for human strategic capability, the capacity to envision distant objectives, to plan complex operations, to coordinate multiple elements, to adapt to unexpected challenges, to persist despite setbacks, and occasionally to achieve results that seem impossible through combination of vision, execution, and luck. The strategies examined demonstrate human intelligence applied to conflict at its most sophisticated, creating achievements that shaped history, while revealing both the possibilities and limits of planned action against intelligent opposition. The commanders who conceived and executed these strategies were individuals facing specific challenges in specific contexts, making decisions with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes that their strategic thinking continues to fascinate and to teach, centuries later testifies to both the brilliance of their achievements and the enduring relevance of the principles they demonstrated. Understanding their strategies enriches appreciation for history, while illuminating timeless principles of effective planning and execution that remain relevant across changing circumstances. The recognition that brilliant strategy can achieve remarkable results, while acknowledging that no strategy guarantees success, that strategic advantages erode through adaptation, and that strategy serves purposes beyond itself. This balanced understanding prevents both excessive cynicism about strategy's value and unrealistic faith in strategic planning's power to overcome all obstacles. Strategy matters enormously. The difference between effective and ineffective strategies often determines victory or defeat, survival or destruction. But strategy is art, not science, requiring judgment, creativity, and adaptability that cannot be reduced to formulas, remaining fundamentally human endeavour where intelligence, experience, and sometimes fortune combine to create outcomes that shape the course of history. The Blitzkrieg strategy, developed by German military theorists in the interwar period and executed with devastating effectiveness in 1939 to 1941, revolutionized modern warfare by integrating mechanization, air power, radio communications, and aggressive operational concepts into a comprehensive approach that achieved unprecedented speed of conquest. Understanding Blitzkrieg reveals how technological innovation combined with doctrinal creativity produces strategic transformation. The conceptual foundations drew on World War I experiences and on theoretical work by military thinkers including Heinz Guderian, who advocated for concentrated armour formations, rather than dispersing tanks among infantry units as most armies planned. The vision was to use tanks not as infantry support but as independent striking forces that could penetrate enemy lines rapidly, driving deep into rear areas to disrupt command, logistics, and reserves before defenders could respond. The organisational innovation was the Panzer Division, combined arms formations including tanks, motorised infantry, artillery, engineers, and support elements capable of independent operations. The divisions could break through enemy lines, exploit into depth, and sustain operations without waiting for foot-mobile infantry to catch up. The organisational structure enabled the operational tempo that characterised Blitzkrieg. The operational concept emphasized penetration at narrow points rather than broad front advances. Concentrated armoured forces would break through weak points in enemy lines, creating narrow penetrations that would then be exploited rapidly and deeply. The breakthrough forces wouldn't pause to widen breaches or to clear bypassed resistance, but would drive forward relentlessly, leaving follow-on forces to consolidate while spearheads maintained momentum. The integration of air power was revolutionary. Close air support from dive bombers like the Stuka provided flying artillery that could strike targets ahead of advancing ground forces. Air superiority operations suppressed enemy air forces and protected German operations. Reconnaissance aircraft provided intelligence about enemy positions and movements. Transport aircraft maintained logistics and moved forces rapidly. The integration of air and ground operations created combined arms effects at operational scales. The communications revolution enabled coordination that previous technologies couldn't support. Radio communications allowed commanders to maintain control of fast-moving operations, to redirect forces based on developing situations, and to coordinate between units separated by distances that would have broken communications in earlier eras. The command and control capabilities enabled by radio were essential for maintaining coherence during rapid operations. The psychological warfare dimension was deliberate and effective. The speed and shock of armoured breakthroughs, the terror inspired by screaming Stuka dive bombers, the appearance of German forces where unexpected, and the rapid collapse of defensive positions created panic and confusion that multiplied the physical effects of German operations. The psychological impact often caused defending forces to collapse before being actually defeated militarily. The Polish campaign of September 1939 demonstrated blitzkrieg's effectiveness. German forces invaded Poland from multiple directions, achieved rapid breakthroughs, surrounded and destroyed Polish forces before they could organise effective defence, and conquered the country in less than a month. The speed shocked observers accustomed to World War I's static warfare, and demonstrated that mobile operations could achieve decisive results rapidly. The French campaign of May-June 1940 represented blitzkrieg's supreme triumph. German forces attacking through the Ardennes, terrain considered impassable for large armoured formations, achieved strategic surprise, broke through at Sedan, drove to the English Channel coast, cut Allied forces in two, and forced French surrender within 6 weeks. The campaign showed how operational-level success through mobile warfare could achieve strategic results that conventional approaches couldn't produce. The operational execution in France demonstrated blitzkrieg principles perfectly. The armoured spearheads under commanders like Guderian drove forward relentlessly, despite concerns from more cautious superiors. The rapid advance prevented Allied forces from establishing stable defensive lines. The psychological shock of German forces appearing where unexpected caused confusion and collapse. The combination of speed, concentration, surprise, and psychological impact achieved results that seemed impossible based on force ratios alone. The Battle of France showed how blitzkrieg strategy could overcome apparently strong defences. French forces were numerous, well-equipped, and positioned behind fortifications, yet the static defensive mindset, the slow decision-making, the inability to respond to rapidly changing situations, and the psychological shock of German operational speed combined to produce catastrophic defeat. The victory demonstrated that operational innovation could overcome numerical and positional advantages. The expansion to the Balkans and the early phases of Operation Barbarossa continued demonstrating blitzkrieg effectiveness. The conquests of Yugoslavia and Greece in spring 1941 showed the strategy worked in varied terrain. The initial Soviet campaign in summer 1941 achieved spectacular encirclements that destroyed entire Soviet armies and advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. The string of victories seemed to validate blitzkrieg as a solution to modern warfare's challenges. However, the limitations began appearing in the Soviet Union. The vast distances meant that even rapid advances didn't achieve decisive strategic effects. Soviet forces could retreat without being decisively engaged, while German supply lines stretched to breaking points. The harsh weather affected mechanized equipment, reducing reliability and mobility. Soviet adaptability and willingness to trade. Space for time negated advantages that rapid breakthrough provided against opponents defending every inch. The strategic limitations of blitzkrieg became clear at Moscow in winter 1941-42. Despite tactical and operational successes, German forces couldn't achieve strategic victory because the operational approach wasn't sufficient when facing enemies with vast resources, strategic depth, and willingness to sustain enormous losses. The recognition that Blitzkrieg couldn't win the war against the Soviet Union forced Germans to fight extended attritional warfare that their strategy and resources weren't optimized for. The Allied counter-strategies eventually neutralized Blitzkrieg advantages. The development of effective anti-tank weapons, the creation of defense in depth that traded space to slow advances, the air superiority that prevented German air support, and the massive material superiority that Western allies achieved all contributed to making Blitzkrieg increasingly ineffective. By 1944-45, attempts at mobile operations were defeated by Allied advantages in numbers, firepower, and air power. The influence on military thinking has been profound and lasting. The recognition that mobile warfare could achieve decisive results rapidly influenced Cold War military planning. With NATO and Warsaw Pact both planning rapid armoured operations, the 1991 Gulf War showed modern versions of Blitzkrieg: rapid manoeuvre, combined arms integration, air-land coordination, achieving spectacular results. Modern doctrines of manoeuvre warfare draw explicitly on Blitzkrieg principles adapted to contemporary technology. The limitations revealed remain instructive. Blitzkrieg succeeded against opponents unprepared for mobile warfare, but failed against opponents with strategic depth, resources, and willingness to adapt. The operational brilliance couldn't overcome strategic mismatches in resources and will. The recognition that operational innovation creates temporary advantages until opponents adapt remains relevant for understanding how military advantages erode through enemy learning. Understanding Blitzkrieg requires recognizing the integration of technology, organization, doctrine, and leadership into comprehensive strategic approach. No single element explains success. Rather, the combination of mechanization enabling mobility, organization creating combined arms capabilities, doctrine emphasizing speed and concentration, air power providing support and reconnaissance, communications enabling coordination, and aggressive leadership driving operations forward, created capabilities that overwhelmed unprepared opponents while proving insufficient against adapted defences backed by superior resources. The lessons about innovation, integration, and limitations remain relevant. Blitzkrieg demonstrated that technological and doctrinal innovation can create significant military advantages and can achieve spectacular tactical and operational results. But it also showed that operational excellence without strategic soundness produces temporary successes that eventually fail when facing opponents with superior resources who adapt effectively. The balance between appreciating Blitzkrieg's genuine innovations and recognizing its ultimate insufficiency provides perspective on strategy's possibilities and limits in modern warfare. Guerrilla warfare strategies represent distinctive approaches where weaker parties resist stronger opponents through irregular tactics, political mobilization, protracted conflict, and refusing decisive battle. Understanding guerrilla strategies reveals how asymmetric warfare operates and how political military integration creates capabilities that conventional military strength alone cannot overcome. The theoretical foundations draw on recognizing fundamental asymmetries between regular forces and irregular resistance. Conventional militaries possess superior firepower, organization, equipment, and training for direct combat. Guerrilla forces cannot defeat conventional forces in decisive battles. Therefore, guerrilla strategy seeks to avoid decisive engagements while inflicting cumulative damage through raids, ambushes, sabotage, and psychological warfare that gradually weakens stronger opponents' will to continue fighting. Mao Zedong's strategic theory provided systematic analysis of guerrilla warfare's phases and requirements. The theory identified 3 phases: strategic defensive, where guerrillas are weak and must focus on survival and building strength; strategic stalemate, where growing guerrilla strength contests enemy control while avoiding decisive battle; and strategic offensive, where guerrillas have grown strong enough to engage in conventional operations and to defeat enemy forces decisively. The integration of political and military strategy was central to Mao's conception. Guerrilla warfare wasn't purely military, but required political mobilization of populations, establishing base areas where guerrillas controlled territory, building administrative structures that provided services and extracted resources, and creating political legitimacy that conventional military force couldn't destroy. The famous metaphor, "gorillas are fish swimming in the sea of popular support," captured the dependence on political foundations. The Chinese Communist guerrilla campaign against Japan, 1937 to 1945, demonstrated the strategy's effectiveness. Despite Japanese military superiority, Communist forces survived, expanded base areas, mobilized peasant support through land reform and resistance to Japanese occupation, and emerged from the war stronger than when it began. The success validated guerrilla strategy's principles and provided model for subsequent revolutionary movements. The Vietnamese strategy against France and later the United States represented guerrilla warfare's most successful modern application. The Viet Minh and Viet Cong combined guerrilla tactics with occasional conventional operations, maintained political infrastructure in contested areas, exploited external support from China and Soviet Union, and sustained operations despite enormous casualties until French and American will to continue fighting collapsed. The victories showed that militarily weaker forces could defeat stronger ones through superior strategy and determination. The operational methods emphasized mobility, surprise and concentration for raids followed by dispersion. Guerrilla forces would concentrate unexpectedly against isolated enemy units or vulnerable installations, attack quickly to inflict casualties and capture supplies, then disperse before enemy reinforcements arrived. The tactical approach avoided enemy strengths while exploiting vulnerabilities created by dispersion necessary for occupation. The political warfare emphasized delegitimizing occupying forces while building alternative authority. Guerrillas portrayed themselves as national liberators, fighting foreign occupation, or as social revolutionaries fighting oppression. The narrative created legitimacy that military force alone couldn't destroy, and that sustained popular support necessary for guerrilla operations. The political struggle was as important as military operations in determining outcomes. The protracted warfare strategy recognized that time favored guerrillas. Conventional forces fighting guerrillas must maintain constant operations across entire territories, at enormous costs in money, lives, and political will. Guerrillas need only survive, inflict occasional casualties, and maintain political infrastructure. The asymmetry and sustainability meant that guerrillas could win by not losing, while conventional forces had to achieve decisive results that irregular warfare made difficult or impossible. The use of sanctuaries and external support proved crucial for sustained operations. Vietnamese forces used Cambodian and Laotian sanctuaries, where American forces couldn't pursue them. Afghan Mujahideen used Pakistani sanctuaries during war against Soviet occupation. The ability to retreat across borders where enemies couldn't follow provided security that enabled force recovery and sustainability, impossible without sanctuaries. The targeting of enemy morale and political will rather than military destruction reflected strategic sophistication. Guerrilla strategies recognized that strong opponents couldn't be defeated militarily, but could be convinced that continued fighting wasn't worth the costs. The objective was making occupation expensive and frustrating, demonstrating that victory was impossible, and waiting for domestic political pressure to force withdrawal. The counter-guerrilla strategies developed by conventional forces revealed difficulty of defeating guerrilla campaigns. The strategies included population control to separate guerrillas from civilian support, fortified hamlets or strategic villages to secure populations, extensive patrolling to maintain presence, and harsh punishment of guerrilla supporters to create fear, preventing cooperation. Yet these approaches often alienated populations they aimed to protect, creating grievances that fed guerrilla recruitment. The failures of conventional forces against guerrillas despite military superiority illuminated warfare's fundamentally political nature. American failure in Vietnam despite overwhelming military advantages, Soviet failure in Afghanistan despite ruthless tactics, and various other defeats of conventionally superior forces by guerrilla movements all demonstrated that political legitimacy and will matter more than firepower when populations determine outcomes. The adaptations of guerrilla strategies to contemporary conditions include urban guerrilla warfare, terrorism as strategy, and asymmetric conflicts using improvised explosives, suicide attacks, and social media for political warfare. The fundamental principles, avoiding enemy strength, exploiting vulnerabilities, sustaining operations politically rather than militarily, and targeting will rather than capabilities, continue informing how weaker parties resist stronger ones. The ethical questions surrounding guerrilla warfare include the targeting of civilians, the use of terror, and the difficulties distinguishing combatants from non-combatants. Guerrilla strategies often deliberately blur these distinctions, using civilian populations as shields and making population control central to conflict. The moral complexities of irregular warfare present challenges that conventional warfare ethics don't fully address. Understanding guerrilla strategy requires recognizing that military weakness doesn't preclude strategic effectiveness. When political mobilization, protracted conflict, and targeting enemy will, rather than capabilities, create paths to victory unavailable through conventional approaches. The strategies demonstrate that warfare is fundamentally political, and that political legitimacy, popular support, and determination can overcome military disadvantages when strategies are adapted appropriately to asymmetric circumstances. As this comprehensive exploration of history's most brilliant military strategies concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition of strategy as distinctive human achievement, the application of intelligence, planning, and adaptation to achieve objectives against opposition. The strategies examined span millennia and continents, from Hannibal's audacious Alpine crossing to modern blitzkrieg, from Mao's revolutionary guerrilla warfare to Mahan's theories of sea power, from Napoleon's operational art to Sun Tzu's indirect approaches. Yet common threads unite these diverse examples, revealing principles that transcend specific contexts while requiring adaptation to particular circumstances. The primacy of clear objectives appears consistently across successful strategies. Commanders who maintained focus on specific, achievable goals and who ensured that tactical operations advanced strategic purposes achieved results that eluded those who won battles without clear sense of what victory should accomplish. Hannibal knew he needed to break Rome's alliance system. Caesar understood that demonstrating overwhelming Roman power repeatedly would eventually break Gallic resistance. Napoleon sought decisive battles that would force favourable peace terms. The clarity of purpose that characterised brilliant strategies prevented the drift toward fighting for its own sake that produces meaningless victories. The integration of intelligence and information with planning and operations emerged as crucial across all successful strategies. From Mongol systematic information gathering years before campaigns, to Napoleon's emphasis on reconnaissance and intelligence, from Sun Tzu's dictum about knowing enemy and self, to modern intelligence operations supporting military planning, the advantage provided by superior knowledge consistently determined outcomes. The recognition that uncertainty is enemy and that information reduces uncertainty makes intelligence central to strategy rather than peripheral support function. The balance between planning and adaptation characterized effective strategies across contexts. None of the brilliant strategies examined succeeded through rigid plan execution. All required continuous adaptation to circumstances, exploitation of unexpected opportunities, and response to enemy actions. Yet the adaptation occurred within strategic frameworks that maintained coherent purposes and ensured tactical adjustments advanced broader objectives. Caesar's flexible responses to diverse Gallic challenges, Napoleon's ability to adjust plans based on developing situations, the Mongol adaptation of tactics to different opponents, all demonstrated that effective strategy requires both vision providing direction and flexibility enabling adaptation. The tempo and initiative dimensions proved decisive across successful strategies, whether through Mongol mobility, Napoleonic operational speed, blitzkrieg's armoured thrusts, or guerrilla harassment preventing enemy consolidation. Maintaining pressure on opponents, preventing their recovery, and keeping them reactive rather than executing their own plans, provided advantages that multiplied other capabilities. The initiative that comes from acting rather than reacting, from choosing the time and place of engagements, and from maintaining operational tempo that prevents enemy effective response, appeared consistently in successful strategies. The integration of multiple elements — technological, organizational, tactical, operational, strategic, political, psychological — into comprehensive systems distinguished brilliant strategies from one-dimensional approaches, Napoleon's core system enabling mobility, artillery employment providing firepower, tactical doctrine ensuring effective execution, and political vision directing operations toward meaningful objectives, all reinforced each other. Mongol mobility, intelligence, psychological warfare, tactical flexibility, and logistical systems created capabilities exceeding any single element's contribution. The systemic nature of effective strategy, where elements combine synergistically, requires thinking beyond individual components to comprehensive approaches. The political-military integration that connects military operations to political purposes received consistent emphasis from the most sophisticated strategic thinkers, Sun Tzu's explicit recognition that warfare serves political purposes, Clausewitz's famous formulation of war as continuation of politics by other means, Mao's integration of political mobilization with military operations, and modern doctrine's emphasis on clear political objectives all reflect understanding that military success without political benefit is strategic failure. The connection between military means and political ends prevents confusing tactical excellence with strategic success. Yet the limitations of even brilliant strategies deserve equal emphasis with their achievements. Hannibal's tactical and operational genius couldn't overcome Rome's superior resources and political will when Carthage provided inadequate support. Napoleon's operational brilliance ultimately failed against coordinated coalitions that adapted strategies to avoid his strengths while leveraging superior aggregate resources. Blitzkrieg succeeded against unprepared opponents, but proved insufficient against enemies with strategic depth and resources. Mongol strategies encountered limits in terrain and operational environments unsuited to cavalry warfare. The recognition that strategy has inherent limitations prevents dangerous overconfidence about planning's power. The fundamental limitation is that strategy cannot overcome massive disadvantages in resources, political will, geographical position, or technological capability. Brilliant strategy can multiply force effectiveness, achieve results conventional approaches couldn't produce, and create successes despite unfavourable odds. But when disadvantages are too great, or when opponents adapt effectively while leveraging superior resources, even brilliant strategy proves insufficient. The sober recognition that strategy cannot overcome all obstacles provides necessary balance to appreciation of strategy's power. The context dependency of strategies means that approaches succeeding brilliantly in particular circumstances may fail completely in others. Mongol cavalry tactics dominated open terrain, but struggled in forests, mountains, and maritime environments. Napoleon's system worked magnificently in rich territories, where armies could live off the land but collapsed in Russia, where logistics couldn't be sustained through foraging. Blitzkrieg overwhelmed France but couldn't achieve strategic victory in the Soviet Union's vast spaces. Guerrilla warfare succeeds where political mobilization is possible, but fails when population support governments or when conventional forces separate guerrillas from popular support. The specificity of strategies to particular contexts requires careful analysis about whether principles from successful strategies apply to different circumstances. The adaptive opposition problem means that no strategy remains effective indefinitely against intelligent enemies. Opponents study successful strategies, develop counters, and adapt approaches to negate advantages. The Allied strategies that eventually defeated Napoleon drew explicitly on understanding his methods and developing responses, avoiding decisive battle, coordinating across multiple fronts, leveraging superior aggregate resources through attrition. The counter-guerrilla strategies, while often failing, represented attempts to adapt to irregular warfare's challenges. The recognition that strategic advantages erode through enemy learning should inspire humility about any particular strategy's permanence, and should encourage continuous innovation to maintain advantages. The technological dimension adds another layer of complexity. Strategies must adapt to available technologies and must anticipate how technological change will affect military capabilities. The transition from muscle-powered to mechanized warfare, the introduction of aircraft and missiles, the development of nuclear weapons, the emergence of cyber capabilities, each technological shift required strategic adaptation. Yet the underlying cognitive challenges, planning under uncertainty, coordinating complex operations, anticipating opposition responses, adapting to unexpected developments, persist across technological revolutions, making historical study relevant despite material changes. The ethical dimensions deserve acknowledgement, even while recognizing that historical commanders often employed methods that modern sensibilities find abhorrent. The Mongol terror tactics, the harsh treatment of civilian populations during various campaigns, the willingness to sacrifice soldiers' lives for strategic advantage, all raise ethical questions about whether effectiveness alone justifies strategies. Modern strategic thinking must balance effectiveness with ethical constraints that historical commanders didn't acknowledge, creating different challenges where moral considerations constrain available options in ways that may reduce purely military effectiveness while maintaining political and moral legitimacy. The contemporary relevance of studying historical military strategies extends far beyond military applications. The principles of strategic thinking, clarity about objectives, gathering and analysing information, balancing planning with adaptation, maintaining initiative and tempo, integrating multiple elements into comprehensive approaches, connecting means to ends through clear logic, apply across domains from business competition to political campaigns to personal decision-making. The cognitive challenges that strategy addresses, planning under uncertainty, anticipating intelligent opposition, adapting to unexpected developments, synthesizing complex information into actionable decisions, characterize countless human endeavors beyond warfare. The future of strategy must account for transformations that create strategic environments fundamentally different from historical contexts. Nuclear weapons, cyber capabilities, autonomous systems, space-based assets, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, all create possibilities and challenges that historical strategists never imagined. Yet the underlying human dimensions, psychology, will, decision-making under uncertainty, adaptation to opposition, likely remain relevant even as material circumstances transform. The study of historical strategies provides frameworks for thinking about these emerging challenges, while recognizing that specific historical solutions don't directly transfer to radically different circumstances. The recognition that humans will continue facing strategic challenges, situations requiring planning, coordination, adaptation, and execution against opposition, or within constrained circumstances, makes strategy enduringly relevant. Whether in warfare, business, politics, or personal life, the cognitive skills that strategy develops, analysing situations, identifying objectives, planning approaches, anticipating opposition, adapting to circumstances, integrating multiple elements, remain valuable for navigating complex competitive and cooperative environments. As light returns and this extensive journey through brilliant military strategies concludes, what lingers is profound appreciation for human strategic capability, the capacity to envision distant objectives, to plan complex operations, to coordinate multiple elements, to adapt to unexpected challenges, to persist despite setbacks, and occasionally to achieve results that seemed impossible through combinations of vision, planning, execution, adaptation, and fortune. The strategies examined demonstrate human intelligence applied to conflict and competition at its most sophisticated, creating achievements that shaped history while revealing both the remarkable possibilities and the inherent limitations of planned action against intelligent opposition. The commanders and strategists who conceived and executed these brilliant strategies were individuals facing specific challenges in specific contexts, making decisions with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, that their strategic thinking continues to fascinate, to teach, and to influence contemporary strategy, testifies to both the brilliance of their achievements and the enduring relevance of the principles they demonstrated. Understanding their strategies enriches appreciation for history, while illuminating timeless principles of effective planning, adaptation, and execution that remain relevant across changing circumstances and technologies. The recognition that brilliant strategy can achieve remarkable results, while acknowledging that no strategy guarantees success, that strategic advantages erode through adaptation, that strategy serves purposes beyond itself, and that strategic thinking requires balancing vision with flexibility, planning with adaptation, and confidence with humility. This comprehensive understanding prevents both excessive cynicism about strategy's value and unrealistic faith in strategic planning's power to overcome all obstacles. Strategy matters enormously. The difference between effective and ineffective strategies often determines victory or defeat, survival or destruction, prosperity or poverty. But strategy remains art rather than science, requiring judgment, creativity, experience, and adaptability that cannot be reduced to formulas or algorithms, remaining fundamentally human endeavour where intelligence, planning, and sometimes fortune combine to create outcomes that shape the course of history, and that reveal what becomes possible when human strategic capability confronts challenges, requiring the best that minds and wills can achieve against opposition, and within constraints that seem insurmountable, yet that brilliant strategy occasionally overcomes through combinations of insight, innovation, execution, and the irreducible element of fortune that accompanies all human endeavours into uncertain futures where outcomes remain undetermined until actions create the realities that define success or failure.